Hello, everyone. I hope your groups are going well. So today we're thinking about John chapter 7. And in John chapter 7, there are lots and lots of questions asked about Jesus. It's a little bit hard to work out kind of a clear structure and break up of it all. But I think I'd start by saying, I could sum it up this way. There's so many questions. On the surface, there's lots of questions about Jesus, but in the end, does it actually raise questions about you or us? One way to summarize, I think, the big idea could be this. On whatever standard you apply, Jesus is confirmed as the Son of God. His testimony checks out. His message checks out that he is from heaven, the Saviour for us. But how will we fare when righteous judgment is applied to us? So there's this definite theme of evaluation, judgment, and the implication, I think, when you think about what Jesus says, is before God, how do we stand? And obviously we fall short, and that brings us to the need of Jesus. There are several things that I think are helpful as background knowledge in studying the passage. First of all, remember that this section really keeps going through to the end of chapter 8. I'm not suggesting you read the passage in the group or anything, but if it continues the dialogue, the exchange between Jesus and the Jews, and kind of reaches a climax at the end of chapter 8 in the temple courts. Secondly, it's worth reading up a bit on the Feast of Tabernacles. I think that helps you understand why Jesus might pronounce himself as the one who provides living water. So in the email, I've provided a couple of articles about that. It's worth just knowing about that. Just provides the backdrop for what Jesus is saying. Remember that Jesus mentions the conflict that happens in John 5 where Jesus heals the invalid, but the real drama from that passage comes out of the fact that he heals him on the Sabbath, and the Jews get very upset about that, and we are told in 5 verse 18 that they are seeking to kill him. So Jesus is not putting out false allegations when he's talking about their desire to kill him. That's way back there in chapter 5 that's happening. And they're not being genuine when they say they're not actually trying to kill him. So in terms of background, it's also worth just thinking about what the law, like Leviticus, Deuteronomy, might say about what Jews were meant to do in terms of properly arriving at a conviction of someone blasphemy. So if they think that Jesus is a false prophet and blaspheming, well, they should have been giving Jesus a proper trial. And Nicodemus really points to that in 7 verse 50 to 51. So it's just interesting to keep in mind the way the Jews are breaking the law they claim they're upholding in many different ways in this passage. And finally, just remember Isaiah 9, that the light of the world will come in Galilee. It's curious, I think, that the Jewish leaders deny that the Christ can come from Galilee, but even the commentator I read didn't mention Isaiah 9, but it's just pretty obvious, I think, that John has this in his background. It's part of the irony going on that the scriptures themselves are pointing to the Messiah coming from Galilee. It's just worth just going back to that, just reflecting on what that means in this whole passage. Okay, so as I say, I'm not totally confident on a breakdown of the passage, but the setting is near the Feast of Tabernacles. Jesus begins in Galilee. He's with his brothers. His brothers urge him to go if he wants to be a public figure. Even his own brothers did not believe in him. In Mark 3:31, they seize Jesus. They try to seize Jesus because they say he's out of his mind. In one sense, this passage reminds me of the famous C.S. Lewis thing about Jesus is either Lord, liar, or lunatic. When you hear Jesus teaching, you either say, yes, it's true what he's saying, he's a liar, and the crowds sometimes accuse Jesus he deceives the people. The Jewish leaders definitely think he's deceiving the people. So is Jesus a liar or is he a lunatic? And I think the brothers might be in that category of just thinking that his brother is crazy, but they kind of say to Jesus, look, you're being a big fish in a small pond. How about you go and try the big pond and see what happens there? Jesus says he won't come yet. He's not sort of saying a lie. He's just saying at that moment he wasn't come. He does come later. He doesn't go at his brother's bidding. What I've done, I've just highlighted in yellow every time there's some sort of judgment cast or comment or evaluation cast on Jesus. And then in green I've put the way Jesus will make statements about the world or about himself. I think it's sort of, the world's judgment versus Jesus' judgment. So the brothers don't believe him. Jesus makes this comment in John 7:7, the world cannot hate you, but it hates me because I testify that what it does is evil. So Jesus is very clear. The world, in its works, is evil. There's a clear judgment from Jesus. The question is, how, is that right, or is others right? Now, Jesus comes to the feast, there's gossip about him, there's a buzz. Some are making the judgment, he is a good man. Others are saying, no, he's a liar, he deceives the people. There's the question of how could Jesus be the Messiah, the great teacher, when he's the carpenter's son from Galilee? He hasn't studied anywhere special. So that casts questions over Jesus. Jesus makes this statement, which I think is really pertinent and powerful. We reflect on in terms of, how do we find out about Jesus? Whether he's actually telling the truth or whether he's lying. Jesus says his teaching is not from himself, but from God. He's coming from God. If anyone chooses to do God's will, he will find out whether my teaching comes from God or whether I speak on my own. So if anyone chooses to do God's will, he'll find out the answer to that question, whether Jesus is telling the truth or lying. Now, when you think about that, for the audience here, that's quite concrete. I mean, to choose to do God's will is to obey God's law, which Book of Moses, the Old Testament, you can sort of test that out, very simply. I will choose to obey the Ten Commandments and let me see if Jesus is actually conforming to them or not. If I'm sincere about wanting to do God's will, I'm going to have clarity about Jesus. Now, what Jesus exposes is, and what we see, is that the Jews who are accusing him of being the deceivers, well, they're actually breaking the law. Has not Moses given you the law yet? Not one of you keeps the law. Why are you trying to kill me? So straight out, they're murderers. They're intent on murdering Jesus. But a bit more subtly, even if they were right about Jesus being a blasphemer or a false teacher, they're not going through the process that the law would give you to actually convict him properly. That's what Nicodemus says at the end. You should be giving Jesus a proper hearing and evaluating him on what he does. So that's the big sort of irony of this whole thing. While people accuse Jesus of being a fraud, etc., they're the ones that are actually exposed by the law as lawbreakers and thereby subject to God's judgment. So the crowd, pulled in by the leaders. Jesus must be demon possessed. They don't understand that the Jews are actually trying to kill him. And this verse is quite crucial. Again, Jesus' statement about to stop judging by mere appearances and make a right judgment. That is, yes, Jesus comes from Nazareth, from Nowheresville. Yes, Jesus doesn't have a great education. On the surface of things, he looks like a nobody, really. But it's not about a superficial judgment. It's about actually working out, okay, what is God's will? What is he truly on about? What does he want? What does the law really say and point towards? And looking at what Jesus does and teaches and saying, well, that actually matches up. You might want to think about how the Pharisees viewed the Sabbath and what Jesus was doing, actually giving life and restoring and healing on the Sabbath, which is more in light of what God's will actually is. Another statement here, the crowds, have the authorities really concluded that he is the Christ? We know where this man is from. When the Christ comes, they will know where he is from. So you have this kind of different leveled kind of discussion where Jesus' earthly birth is in Bethlehem. John doesn't directly record that, but we know that. He's from Galilee. We know because of Isaiah 9, that's where the Christ is going to shine his light. But Jesus will often come back to the fact that he's actually from heaven. That's the ultimate origin of Christ, from the Father sent to the world. And there's this constant kind of back and forth amongst the people. When the Christ comes, we'll do more miraculous signs in this man. There's no denying he's doing all sorts of signs. Jesus pronounces himself as the one who can satisfy anyone's thirst, and he's talking about the gift of the Spirit. So that's a bold statement in the light of the Feast of the Tabernacles. Water is significant in that feast, and so basically Jesus is kind of saying, look, I am the fulfillment of what this feast is pointing to. I can give you overflowing water, and I can give you the Spirit, life from God. More judgments about Jesus. Surely this man is the prophet. He is the Christ. How can this Christ come from Galilee? Again, that's another little ironic thing where we know he can come from Galilee. People are divided. Observation just is no one ever spoke the way this man does. So if we're exercising proper judgment, we should be thinking, okay, what is it about this man that he speaks this way? Is he lying? Is he crazy? Is he actually from heaven? And the Pharisees are just defiant and just end up really exposing their stubborn hearts. And all they've got left is, has anyone else believed? Have any of the rulers believed in him? No. So, just because their leaders are not believing it, that's what they're left with. And the irony again here, they're saying the crowd, the mob, knows nothing of law, that they're kind of the cursed riffraff, but they themselves are ignoring the law by not giving Jesus a proper hearing, and they themselves are neglecting the prophecy of Isaiah. And if we look into it, we find that Jesus actually fulfills all the expectations of the Old Testament. There are lots of questions about Jesus. They are all answered in the positive and affirmative as to what he's saying. The question is, who are we? And are we genuinely seeking the will of God? Do we stand up to the tests that God applies to us? And what are we going to do about that? Well, I think it's pretty obvious. We fall short. We are corrupt. We've broken God's law. We stand condemned. We need the one who came and offered living water. We thirst for righteousness. We need Jesus. And we need his Spirit to come and make us new. Hopefully there's some helpful pointers there. I hope you enjoy studying John 7. Thanks.